Welcome to the first slot of the Neuromorphic Computing course. Thanks a lot for showing up, and I hope you'll enjoy the course, this one and the other 3 slots that we have. So I will start with sketching the goals of this course so that you make sure that you're in the right one. So my goal here will be first to define neuromorphic computing. What is this field? How is it different from maybe neighboring fields? What is its relation to the neighboring fields? Then I hope that after the course you'll be able to kind of appreciate the potential and strength of neuromorphic computing hardware, but also realize its limitations. So I'm not going to create any hypes here. Then one of my goals would be to kind of explain and convey where we stand today on neuromorphic algorithms. So what kind of principles and building blocks I think are emerging now, what kind of tools are available to program neuromorphic hardware, and what kind of computational frameworks do people develop today. The whole field is in development and emerging, so many things that I tell here, they're not textbook stuff, so it's not something that that's postulated truth. This is my interpretation that I see emerging in the community. Then I'll showcase some applications that are already out there today. They're usually small scale and modest, I would say, but I will also try to project in the future where we see this hardware being applied. And then just introduce you to the ecosystem, like who are the main players, what are the different subgroups. As in every community, probably it's always exciting to have a deeper look into that. I have one slide just introducing myself so that you know who is talking here. Maybe one note on the very beginning, you have seen on the first slide that I have 2 affiliations, and I was introduced here as Intel. I was Intel Labs 100% until very recently, and starting from March this year, I got a professorship at Zurich University of Applied Sciences, so now I'm building my independent research group while still having a 20% Intel hat. So what I will tell you today, I don't tell you with Intel's hat, I tell you with the professor's hat. That's why it's kind of fair, comprehensive overview of neuromorphic computing field, and I will not focus more on Intel's hardware more than on any other hardware out there. Okay, so who am I? I'm a physicist by training. I studied physical optics and biophysics many years ago, mostly in Belarus, my home country, but also a little bit in Germany. Then I did my PhD in the field that is called neuronal dynamics modeling. So it's a subfield of computational neuroscience, you could say, but it also had a flavor of cognitive science. So we were working together with behavioral scientists, and we're also working in robotics, because our field of study was embodied cognition. So the question how intelligence and cognition emerge in interaction with the world. And if you build an artificial system like that, you do need a robot to demonstrate that whatever you've built can emerge in the real world interaction. So these are kind of the 3 subfields in which I was working during my PhD and then postdoc. And then I moved to Zurich, to Institute of Neuroinformatics there, and was leading a group that was called Neuromorphic Robotics there. So I was building algorithms for neuromorphic hardware, and then demonstrating again that they can control autonomous agents, robotic agents. I have started working with neuromorphic hardware in 2007, so way before 2015. I met neuromorphic people at a workshop, a Telluride workshop for neuromorphic engineering, and that's the first kind of community to keep an eye on. And then in 2020, I joined Intel, the Neuromorphic Computing Lab. Kind of opened a new group in Munich. We called it Applications Research Group. So I was working again on algorithms and systems based on neuromorphic chip developed by Intel. And just looking all around the community, the ecosystem, where the good applications for this hardware are. And then since March this year, I'm leading this research center called Cognitive Computing and Life Sciences at Zurich University of Applied Sciences. And one contribution to the community of mine was that I coordinated NeuroTech. That was an European Union coordination and support action. And we attempted to create the community of neuromorphic computing in Europe. And that allowed me to have a nice overview of the field. Hardware, software, applications, trying to put a couple people together and create the community. So that's me. So trying to establish some authority here. I kind of know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about neuromorphic computing. So that's why this lecture will be either interesting or completely alien for you, one of the two. Because what I will start with is theory and history of neuromorphic computing, but basically some basic neuroscience knowledge. Because if you get in touch with this field, you will notice that a lot of the jargon that people use, a lot of the words that they use, soma, dendrite, axons, it all comes from neuroscience. So first, it's good to know what they are talking about. Second, it's good to put it a little bit in the perspective, to understand from what level of description of neuronal systems this whole jargon and this whole field comes from. Because then you can better judge how much you should buy into the system, what is valuable in this field, and what is maybe kind of arbitrary. Okay, and I'll show you some basic examples. Tomorrow in the second lecture, I will dive into neuromorphic hardware, and I will just go over a couple systems that are out there. I have selected the systems because they are pretty mature, and the ecosystem and tools around them are pretty mature. You can usually use the systems either on the cloud, or you can talk to the developers, you can get it on your desk. There is a software ecosystem where you can program these devices. So these are kind of mature enough so that they can be used. So to be Loihi 1 and 2, these are Intel's chips. Spinnaker 1 and 2, those are from the Human Brain Project. This is a big European project. Dynap and Rolls are from Institute of Neuroinformatics, and I will start here actually talking about those already today. So I think historically those have a special role, and also a special role for me because I started my neuromorphic journey with these two devices. They are, so the first two are digital devices, so they use conventional electronics. Spinnaker is an architecture based on ARM core processors. Loihi is a bit more specialized processors, but more or less conventional digital processors. Dynap and Rolls are mixed signal chips. So they use very large scale integration circuits that are analog to realize these neuroscience-like circuits. And then Spec and Xilo are one of very few real products that you can buy. So they're from a startup that is based in Zurich as well. Odin is another digital chip, and I actually will also talk about brain scales. That's another chip from the Human Brain Project that also is interesting to look into. Okay, so tomorrow, so today, the introduction is very gentle and I'd say slow, right? So we'll just get to know a little bit neuroscience. Tomorrow it will be a bit more hot-paced. We'll just go over all these chips and try to cover them all. Hopefully still with enough time for questions. And then the third lecture will be all about neuromorphic software and algorithms. So software, the tools and frameworks used to program neuromorphic hardware. When I say frameworks, the neuromorphic hardware is so different from any other, from the other two pieces of hardware out there, CPU or GPU, FPGA, that we have to rethink. So what an algorithm even means on this hardware. How do we program it? And people have come up now with 2-3 kind of computing frameworks, how they think this hardware can be programmed. So we'll go over those, and then just some examples of algorithms or neuronal architectures, models that solve different tasks. Going beyond deep learning, if that's an issue for anyone. And finally, in the final lecture, I'll show you some applications out there. So what have people built that actually works, maybe even is already a product or close to becoming a product, and we'll introduce all the communities. And then you can ask questions. We can talk about politics and politics in academia and in industry, and just the development of technology and future, and then answer all the remaining questions. All right, so that's the overview. Any questions? Maybe wishes, like?
I'm interested in audio applications. So I know that Intel is running a neuromorphic deep noise suppression challenge.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's one of the kind of seemingly low-hanging fruit type of application and useful, right? So dynamic noise suppression. It is also useful to have it low power and small shape factor, right? If you think about like earpods. So this is considered one of the applications well suited for neuromorphic hardware.
I know there's some focus maybe in academia on biological plausibility of some of the choices, but also interested to see how many of those translate into viable engineering decisions and so on.
Okay. Yeah, I think we might kind of get into there, right? Not obligatory explicitly in my slides, but maybe behind the lines. Yeah, two behind the lines. So a little, how do you say it? disclosure. So I lost my slides on the way here. I forgot my computer somewhere, and the file, this PowerPoint file was too huge, so my system didn't upload it on the cloud. So I have recovered them today based on a PDF. Spent a lot of time there. So the slides, I know what they are, and I'll talk a lot between the lines. So please be here, present, and listen and ask questions, take notes. Yep. Okay, bring it. First fireworks.
So my question is, basically you see like a software and hardware, neuromorphic software. So both the software and hardware are based on the neuromorphic theory, or it is conventional software mapped to neuromorphic hardware?
There's actually a little bit of both. So when I will talk about the software, I will distinguish, so now what is neuromorphic software? It could be your favorite deep learning trained network. You train it with backpropagation, maybe with normal backpropagation, maybe with spiking backpropagation, and then you put it on the chip, usually just for inference. Maybe if you're particularly sophisticated, you also run some continual learning, maybe in the last layer to fine-tune the architecture. This is one way to program neuromorphic hardware. Another way would be to look at biology and see, oh, there are so many different circuits in there. And I'll talk about that a little bit today, like in the historical fashion. And you can just try to implement these circuits on your chip. And there you might start thinking, what kind of programming tools will help me to do that? And that's maybe what Intel's software framework Lava is about. How to give you tools that you can construct all kinds of neuronal network models. They are not just feed-forward, they are not just convolutional, they are like any circuit you like. Some little circuit of a grasshopper that I'll show you today, and you can wire the network up like that. Or the third basket is indeed you just take some conventional algorithm, I don't know, SLAM or PID, the controller, proportional integral derivative controller, and I look at the argument and say, how could I map it on this hardware that I have? And some chips are more well-suited to do this last thing than others. So some of the academic chips, for instance, that use these analog circuits to really mimic the dynamics of spiking neurons, they might restrict you very much in your computational primitives, so that your favorite SLAM algorithm, you might have real difficult times to implement it in this hardware. If you look at either Spinnaker or Loihi chip, those are almost general-purpose processes. So they are general-purpose processes, maybe with a little simplified instruction set. There are many of them, massively parallel system of those, and a certain network on chip to exchange messages. So many algorithms would probably map nicely on a system like that, which are not obligatory have anything to do with biology. So you could look in some optimization algorithms, you can look in the controller algorithms, and just map them on this hardware. The work there is just starting, I would say, pretty rudimentary. So I think many of you guys working on compilers, so one could define this field today. Because the neuromorphic field, people have spent a lot of time figuring out how to build this hardware. Some people were focusing on biological plausibility when doing that, because they wanted to understand the brain better when doing that. Others were more pragmatic, like Intel, for instance, was more pragmatic. They just wanted to build a chip that does something useful, ideally 5 orders of magnitude better than anything else. But people were busy building hardware, and now we have some hardware that works. Now we can start building compiler, runtime, algorithmic frameworks, software tools, like building the whole stack. Everyone is welcome to join. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I want to ask, will there be a subsection talking about the limitation of neuromorphic computing, also the future perspective or future direction development, like this kind of stuff, based on your long-term professional experience?
Definitely, definitely.
Okay.
I think it will be woven in through the whole lecture course, like the limitations. I will highlight them in any moment that's relevant. And in the last session, we can also dive in, in a discussion, for instance. The future developments, I can kind of sketch, name a couple points, but no, we can put more on the table, I think, just here with questions. Thank you. All right, I'll leave the microphone there with you. Okay, that's the plan. So, lecture 1, theory and history of neuromorphic computing. So, both the theory and the history of neuromorphic computing are rooted in trying to build another brain, right? So, the brain is fascinating. The brain is the most fascinating object in the universe, I would claim, because the whole universe, more or less, fits into there. And the human brain is approximately 1 kilogram of matter. consumes very little power, right, somewhere right around 20 watt. Don't get too fooled by this number, because in fact it's still like a lot of energy compared to the rest of the body, right? So that it still consumes most of the energy in your body. So it's not like it's like some cheap and easy thing, but still like extremely power efficient. Some of it might be just biology, right? So that biology just found a way to be more efficient than our technology that we build today. But some of it might actually be computational principles used. So the big belief is that we probably could learn something from the brain, how brain does computation. Now you could say, yeah, sure, but look at the other numbers, like 80 billion neurons, that's really a lot. Especially taking into account each neuron is pretty complicated thingy. It's not just a transistor, it's like more complicated thing. And connections, like really, really many. We barely can build neuromorphic systems of that size today. Some people do. So some people simulate those and FPGAs, and these big European projects, they also build systems that get close to these numbers. But still you could say, okay, human brain is so complex and so huge, and it's like complexity is immense. Just hopeless to try to mimic that. And I could buy that, yeah, maybe. But we can also look at other brains. So this is a brain of a fruit fly, right? That's less intimidating, right? The neurons are almost countable, 100,000 neurons. Connections also fine, teeny tiny, and does amazing things, right? So, I have some random video. Oh, wait, Apple just went on. It's a second. Yeah, whatever. We don't care that the genes are manipulated. But they can fight, they can fly, they can find fruit. They have these eyes, so most of these neurons, like 80%, actually just deal with vision, just to get from A to B. Pretty sophisticated animals. There's another animal that I like to show in these talks. That's a little colibri bird. It has 2 grams of a brain, like a little bit more. But still, like the control task that it solves, it's amazing. Like, it's flying, it's visually controlling, it's like very, very precisely. It can learn on the fly, it can orient in the environment. Another example could be bees. How amazing bees are. Also, they have 1 million neurons, I think. They can go to places, they can find food, they can go back, they can communicate to their fellow bees. Here there was food over there, can point to where the food was. Quite a lot of computation. We actually understand quite a lot about these circuits. So there's a way how one can learn from biology. Why should we learn from biology? Well, if we look at neural networks out there today, just a quick flash, and I will focus on neural networks for autonomy, just to have kind of level field, because all those animals that I have shown, they don't just classify patterns, right? They don't really do what large language model does. So if you just look at neural networks in robotics, right? There are a couple examples here. One from OpenAI. This is when they trained the neural network to control robotic hand to manipulate a Rubik's Cube. Relatively simple task. It doesn't solve the Rubik's Cube, it just manipulates it, right? So the solution is kind of a separate story. It does it by observing the hand from 6 cameras, right? So these are kind of the different views, maybe 3 cameras here. And then it has a bunch of deep neural networks to analyze that visual information, and then to learn the controller in each state of the cube and the hand, how shall I move it? So the interesting kind of fun fact about this network, it used something on the order of 100 GPUs, 900 CPUs, and was trained for 9 months. Again, a lot. There are some other examples which are a bit kind of smaller, but also they took a lot of training. And the overall kind of understanding of neural networks today is that they culminated today in something like ChatGPT, which training took a lot of money and a lot of energy, and it just feels not quite how the biology does it. And the question is even if it goes in the right direction. So if we look at this curve, you might know it. It shows how the training time and power consumption for neural networks was growing, like for the most favorite neural network of the year, how it was growing over time. And in this period, it kind of skyrocketed a little bit, and then in these 3 years, the slope definitely didn't become like more shallow. And so more and more power is consumed, 300,000 times more power in 6 years, like over there, and only 8 times, the hardware only became 8 times faster. So this is one story, and you're of course well aware of that, right? As hardware developers, you want to develop hardware that makes these kind of things more efficient. I would make a more fundamental question, are these the right things at all, like to focus on? And just a couple problems with them, which I think are hiding a big iceberg behind that. You know, these networks have a problem with transparency. You know, you train them, you have the network, and then it can do funny things, like it suddenly gives a completely wrong answer to a picture that to a human eye is the same picture, you know, the same gibbon. There were just a few pixels have been changed with some smart algorithm, so it fools your network completely, and you have no idea what happened. Because, you know, you train your network, it has many, many layers, many, many weights, and you don't really know what role each of those weights is playing. It's impossible to know that. No, your solution is like nicely distributed in the system. So it's not transparent. It solves the problem. You don't know how well it solves it. You don't know will it still solve it, you know, tomorrow. So all the safety and security and robustness, big, big question marks. Especially if you now start using them for autonomous systems, right, where things actually move something in the physical world, could hurt someone, where it matters. If it's just about, you know, the picture that I got drawn by Dali, maybe I don't like it, I'll get another picture, no problem. If it's a more critical domain, that's actually problematic. And then adaptivity is another problem. So if you have trained this network, you better stick to it. So, you know, the OpenAI have trained the big ChatGPT model, and now they can hope that for a while, people will have fun playing with it. Maybe for a year, maybe for two, enough to earn enough money, then they will switch to another one. If I'm in some domain, let's say I'm in manufacturing, and I build some nice products, and I build these ones for a month, next month I want to build some other products, so I need to retrain my network. And retraining network from scratch takes a long time. Adjusting network a little bit is also tricky. So this whole field of continual learning is struggling and struggling. One could question, like, you know, did we start even in the right point, like, for our struggle? So there are big question marks about deep learning in general and what neural networks, artificial neural networks are today. And why does it matter so much? Because, you know, we need this AI everywhere in our modern world that gets more and more modern. You know, this automation in terms of robotics is important to bring it in some more complex domains than where it is deployed today. We have all this AR, you know, VR vision that, you know, we could help workers to learn some instructions, you know, for some task with AR. So there are some nice and interesting applications where, you know, this AI is needed. Smart homes, or factories, or cities, or hospitals. You know, translation. So DeepL works quite nicely, but maybe there could be even more devices that would help us understand each other, even if we don't share the language. So a lot more AI is needed, and if we now have this heavy-duty AI with all these like little but serious problems everywhere, like this is a question, sustainability, not just in terms of energy consumption, but also in terms of, you know, safety and reliability. We'll build all the system, and then they, you know, suddenly might all break, and then we sit there with all the technology that doesn't work. Yeah, so I think it's really important to kind of question the status quo, and especially in academic community, to think outside the box and to question these deep architectures, the feed-forward perceptron, convolutional architecture, and transformer architecture. Is it all we need? Can we look left and right? All right, that's my pledge, to look left and right. Okay, so now let's go back to the brain for quite a while. So what have we learned from the brain so far? And one could say brain is so complicated, just forget it. We can learn nothing from it. And I don't think so. So I have now distilled 3 things that we have learned from the brains. The first one is that there are very specialized sensing and motor control circuits. So I know it would be really nice to have one magical formula, one rule that you can just write down for your whole brain, for your whole large system, and it will just learn it. This is what is so fascinating by deep learning. You have a pretty simple gradient descent backpropagation rule, and you can do all kinds of things. Well, not all kinds of things. There are many, many things that you cannot do with that. You can actually only do one thing with that, learn a mapping from input to output, you know, from picture to label, from sound wave to label. Anything else is difficult. So what we see in biology is all kinds of specialized sensing motor control circuits. Of course, in our brain, and I'll talk a little bit about that too, but particularly fascinating is in insect brains. So I have a couple examples, my favorite ones. So one is a locus giants motion detector neuron. It's a single neuron in the grasshopper that detects a looming stimulus. So if something is looming at the grasshopper, there's one neuron that immediately signals that and the grasshopper jumps away. And it's one neuron, but it has kind of complicated dendritic tree that goes onto the retina, the eye of this animal, and then the connectivity, like the non-linearities in this dendritic tree, make this neuron react to looming stimulus and nothing else. You can go left, right, you can have all kind of stimuli, but only the looming one will make it jump. So that's why trying to catch the grasshopper is so difficult. Another one is all kind of olfactory circuit. So it's also a very specialized circuit in the smell kind of organ that allows an animal to learn in one-shot fashion some smell. Like, you smell something, smells unpleasant, boom, I will avoid that thing from now on. And I won't go in detail of this circuit. Another fascinating circuit in a fly, so the Drosophila fly, like, the 0.1 gram brain. So it has a structure that physically looks like a ring of neurons. And so if you modify these neurons genetically so that they light up when they're active, and you make the fly run like on a little ball, and you can see that this circuit does something like a compass, like it tracks orientation of the fly. It goes left, and then you see like little activity bump going left or right. So it's a little like neuronal circuit that does something like path integration. So when this fly is going to the right, it tracks that it's going to the right. It does it in the dark as well. It does it a bit better if there's light, there's visual input. So quite fascinating, and it was kind of decoded, right? So people know exactly what happens in that circuit, how it's built. Okay, so the first, they're very specialized sensing and motor control circuits. The second insight, there's large diversity of neuron types, connectivity motifs, network structures, and topologies. And I'll give you a couple very important examples. The first one are the neocortical layers. So first, like the basic neurophysiology, cortex, right, is this thing that makes us smart. And the cortex is not just a sheet of neurons, it's a 6-layer sheet of neurons. So there are 6 layers in the cortex all over the brain, in visual areas, auditory areas, everywhere 6 layers. And these layers are wired in a stereotypical, in a very funny way. So some of them get sensory input, others get kind of top-down input. So if I'm in V1, there will be some neurons that get input from V2, or maybe even V3. Some other neurons get the lateral input, so from other V1 neurons. Some get sensory input. And then they are all like interconnected, the layers among each other, so that they seem to do something like predictive coding. So like in predictive coding, you make the prediction what will happen next, and then you subtract that from your current sensory input, so that you don't react to something that you expect. You only react to something that's unexpected. So it seems that the structure like that is just spread all over the cortex. So it's not just as a neuron sitting in V1, it does the linear rectify thingy, detects the sum has surpassed the threshold, and then passes the signal to the next layer. Not at all. So there's a little circuit that does this predictive coding computation. This is first. The second little fun fact about the brain and the cortex is that 90% of connections are actually top-down. Only 10%, like 5 to 10%, are bottom-up. So if you're thinking about your deep learning network, where 100% is feed-forward, bottom-up. So input comes, and then it goes over layers, 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 in the end, the label. My mom, or the car, or whatever. In the brain, it's the other way around. 90% is going back. And the current input is just a little hits here and there, what could be the actual situation. Okay, so, and this is the circuit. It's called canonical microcircuit, how people call it. This thing, quite fascinating. Another example, which is has been very important in neuroscience, is hippocampus. Now, hippocampus is this mid-brain structure. It looks like, this seahorse, I think the animal is called. And it seems to be responsible. So first people found it in rats that were navigating in an environment. So people thought it's like a map-forming circuit. So it forms the map of the environment. And they have made experiments to show, look, it's like this rat learned the map. You put it in another room. You see how the map transforms. So people called it place cells, what they see in this, in this brain area. Then other people have studied it a bit more deeply, and then they found other cells that are maybe more like time cells. So they said there are some cells that encode time. So it seems like this is a machinery that kind of encodes space and time, kind of movement and translation. And then other people are studying hippocampus in relation to episodic memory. And there maybe you can see how this all comes together, right? So it's not just in space and in time, it's also maybe in your like feature space, and just forms episodic memory. Episodic memory is when you have a flashback. Suddenly you're reliving an episode. You smell some smell from your grandmother's house and you're like transformed there. So that's the hippocampus seems to be involved there. So a lot is known about this circuit. These people found these place cells, got some Nobel Prizes for that, and then everyone wanted to study place cells and hippocampus. So we know a lot about the structures there. Cerebellar architecture, I won't go in such depth. I will just say that this cerebellum is this small hindbrain part of the brain that has as many neurons as the rest of the brain, just very densely packed, seems to be involved in movement generation and seems to do something like fine-tuning of movement or learning to coordinate different muscles to each other. So it's like a huge forward and inverse kinematic models, for those of you who works with robotics, that is constantly kind of tuned and adapted to control movement. And last but not least, basal ganglia. I think there are also fascinating structures inside the brain. So these are little nuclei. It's not the cortex, it's inside the brain. There are a couple of them. They have also some funny connectivity structure. And what they seem to be doing, they seem to inhibit the output of the brain. So that because what the brain is doing all the time, like because of this structure, is to simulate what will happen next. What if I do this, and then I do this, and then I do that? Doing this reinforcement learning business, like trying to predict what will happen and evaluate, is it a good thing, is it not a good thing? So when you do that, you don't want to actually move, right? But there's activity in your brain that is exactly the same as when you move. So what basal ganglia is doing is just inhibiting the output, and don't move, and then occasionally disinhibiting this or that thing when you make a decision to actually move, to actually do something. So quite a fascinating, very powerful circuit. It goes like to the whole cortex, like figuring out, so what are we doing now, guys? And then like talking to the motor system, okay, guys, now we do this or that. Those guys told me. Okay, so a lot of structure, a lot of complexity, but a lot of knowledge is out there in the field. So I think in terms of the algorithms, there's a lot of inspiration out there. All right, so what did neuromorphic computing field, what has it taken from the neuroscience so far? And we'll change the register like massively, because what it has taken are very simple things. Very, very simple things from neuroscience of the 50s. And to put it in perspective, our today's deep learning is neuroscience of the 30s and 40s, and today's neuromorphic computing is neuroscience of the 50s and 60s. So what do we know from neuroscience? So we know that neurons are not just dots or little circles in a diagram. They look more like something like this, right? This is one of the neurons, probably pyramidal cell. I think there are 100 different types of cells, but you can like trees, there are different trees with different shapes, but you can always say there are some elements that are shared. But this is how biological neuron usually looks like. This is a simplified version of that, and here we can see the substructures, and these words are used in neuromorphic computing actually. So you can hear a word soma. Soma is usually what is in deep learning, this output function, this rectify linear function or some sigmoidal function. So soma sums the inputs, makes some little nonlinearity, produces the output. Then in neuromorphic computing, there's another word that people use, dendrites or dendritic compartments. Dendritic compartments. For instance, on Loihi, people talk about multi-compartmental neuron and dendritic compartments. And actually in low-level hardware, they don't talk about neurons, they talk about dendrites. So the dendrites is the input kind of ports of a neuron, if you want. So they are marked here. So these are the locations where other neurons connect to this neuron. So the neuron has some branches, and other neurons connect to these different branches. And each branch can get connections from several neurons and can do some little nonlinearity itself. So, the soma is this big guy who collects from all the branches, but each of these dendrites actually does a similar thing as the soma, just more locally. So that's why people talk about multi-compartmental neurons. So the neuron is not just one non-linearity, but maybe a bunch of non-linearities that are then combined again in non-linearity. This is how you can get something like this giant motion detection neuron in a grasshopper, single neuron that does already some complex computation, because it's a single neuron, but has a tree of these dendritic non-linearities on its input. So it can already do some meaningful computation. And then the third element of the neuron is called axon. Axon is the output port. An output port is usually one. Like on this neuron, you see this dendritic tree. So this is all the branches where a neuron can get input from other neurons. And those in biological neurons can be up to like 10,000. So on average, I think it's 10,000 kind of inputs. In cerebellum might even be more. And then there's a single output that sends the spike. So now, in terms of activation function, so in classical artificial neuronal networks, your inputs are numbers, right? They come to a neuron, the neuron sums them up, makes a nonlinearity. In biological neurons, there are of course no numbers. There are something people call action potentials. So there's a little pulses. They are electrochemical, like electrical pulses. They use it like this. So maybe we start with the output. So the output of a neuron is the burst of kind of electricity, boom. Really strong, it's like gigantic pulse that goes out on this axon and then goes to all the other downstream neurons and then like, arrives at these dendrites. And then in dendrites, what it does, it causes a jump in electrical potential in this dendrite. So the dendrite has some cell membrane like, like a little capacitor, causes the jump in its electrical potential. And then it will decay. The spike comes, makes a jump, and then it's over. It's a pretty short pulse, and then it will decay. And now if another jump comes, it will jump up again. Now if your jumps come often enough, what can happen is that the neuron will reach some threshold when positive feedback loop will happen, some biochemical stuff, some channels open and it just accelerates, and it makes the spike itself. Boom. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. So a question that I noticed that if there's multiple spikes coming to the, will cause some memory variation of the neuron, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if those spikes, they will cause the same scale of the memory variation or no? Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's pretty stereotypical. So it's pretty similar with some fluctuation because it's still a biological process. So there's some, you can say like quantum thingies, right? So there can be more or less molecules released in the process because this charge, right, at least at the connection between two neurons, yeah, so this charge is carried with ions. Calcium, natrium, so potassium or natrium or chlorine, things with different ions, which are pretty heavy, but they carry the charge. And there might be more or less of those released, right? So there's some fluctuation. But if you measure, because what people have been doing, these neurophysiologists, they just stick an electrode. You see this little thing there, it's an electrode, right? And they literally measure like what happens there electrically. And this is what they have observed. And so if you look at these measurements, they're pretty like similar. There might be some fluctuation, which is maybe less than 10% of the amplitude. And there's a big debate. Does it matter? Does the form, the shape of all these potentials changes, does it matter or does it not matter? And only the fact that there was a spike matters. So the neuromorphic computing people, they say only the fact that there was a spike matters. That helps us to build the systems in a pretty efficient way. Because what we need to do now, if we want to mimic the system, is to have some way that will make the neuron do this kind of stuff. Go up if there is input coming in, and then decay like this, right? And then go up, and then have some threshold, so be able to compare to a threshold. If the threshold is reached, then communicate this spike as well. And I can imagine they had long debates, like how to communicate the spike, what to do there. So what they decided to do is to do this spike communication digitally. Because they postulate the shape of the spike doesn't matter. Only what matters is the fact that there was a spike, and that we can encode in a normal binary digital way. Will be simpler, then we can build the systems that we can scale. So this is kind of a simplified neuron with the level of abstraction that neuromorphic computing people have now adopted. So a neuron is usually a single thing. So it might have compartments, but in a simplified version it will only have soma. It will have these input connections. They are sometimes called dendrites, but very often they're one dendrite for one input kind of input connection. And then you get these input spikes. They are summed like with these type of dynamics, and then each time they reach a threshold, there's an output. That's it. Okay, now coming back to neurophysiology. So how would you mathematically model this kind of thing? The people, the biologists were measuring, seeing these potentials. They really wanted to have some mathematical formula for that. So how do you do that? So they were doing their measurements. If a single spike arrives, you see a curve like that. If there are two spikes arrive, you see a curve like that. If there are many spikes arrive in some succession, then you see the spike. See the curve like that. So they were just then kind of empirically, heuristically writing down equations that would describe what happens. And the equation usually has a form like that. So U is your membrane potential. This is this voltage that you measure. And then it has some dynamics that has some shape. So this eta function is just the shape of the dynamics. And they were playing around, let's see, with different forms of this shape function, like before the spike and after the spike. So typically some exponential kind of going up and then going down after the spike is what people agreed in the community. Let's model it like that. Let's model it with exponentials. Exponentials are nice. And then it has the sum of all the inputs coming to this neuron, and then some resting potential. And then they postulate if your membrane potential reaches some threshold from below, then you do a spike. And a spike is like a discontinuity. So if you work with some spiking neural network simulators that implement these dynamics and just solve them as dynamical equation, as differential equation with some Euler, Runge, Kuta, right? They just solve them numerically. Then typically the spiking moment is a discontinuity, right? So if this happens, then you just tell everyone else I have spiked. Okay, so this is the shape of the potential. And then what people, like another term that people use is a spike train. So usually if you have a bunch of neurons and you want to send them input, you will send input as a spike train. And the spike train is just a sequence of spikes. So it's a sum of delta functions. Delta function is just, little thingy like that. So it's not quite a delta function, but just the fact that you have spiked. So one spike train could, for instance, be a vector like this. This is some time. And in this time, in time slot 5, 7, 17, and 35, there's a spike. So again, in the spiking network simulators, they will talk about the spiked input spike train and an output spike train. So this is how you can drive this system and analyze this system. Okay, so now we want to do some computation with this type of system. To do computation, we need to represent values somehow, right? So usually, we measure something, like maybe the weight of this glass, right? I need to represent this number, right? In computer, I represent it with numbers, and then in the end, they're binary numbers, all good. Here, where do numbers come in? Any ideas? Well, you can just think about the problem, right? So how do, these neurons in biological system, they represent something. They represent the position of, fly in front of me so that I can, as a frog, can now snap it and catch it. Or maybe it represents my rotation angle, right? Somehow, like as a fly. How does it do it with this boom, 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 boom with the spikes? So there are a couple kind of methods, how people postulate the neurons probably represent values. And it's called neural coding. So how do neurons code? I don't want to use the word information, so maybe just measurement or values, things. And there are a couple principles that people use there, or a couple versions or methods. The most popular one, the one that most neuromorphic hardware people would use, implicitly or explicitly, is rate coding. What is rate coding? Is when I either take a single neuron or I take a population of neurons and I just measure the average firing rate. How many spikes per second does this neuron emit? And it's kind of a good measure, right? Because remember, if the spikes come seldomly, then they will probably hit my neuron, the memory potential will go up, then it will decay. Then the next spike comes, it will just do it, it will never spike out, right? So the output will be low. So like seldom spiking corresponds to low value. And if it's often, right, then I will get a hit, I will decay, but only a little bit I'll get a hit, and I will reach the activation threshold quickly. By the way, on that plots that I have shown, there were two spikes, and they made the neuron fire. the biological neurons, you need more like hundreds of spikes to fire. So you really need like high firing rate. So that's what is called the rate coding. If you will look at some modern neuromorphic architectures that take deep network trained and put it on a chip, what they will very often use is rate coding to encode values, right? So in deep network, you have this vector. Let's say it comes from an image and it has numbers there, right? Numbers that represent intensity in your image, right? Between 0 and 255, and then you scale it down between 0 and 1 numbers. So to represent these numbers in spiky neurons, they will encode them with firing rate, right? Low firing rate, low number, high firing rate, high number. And this for every neuron in this vector. You can already think about pros and cons, right, of encoding like that. And anyone can think about pros and cons? Shall we do it with the mic?
Like in the first case, suddenly your precision, like your bit width, depends on the delta t. So if you want more precision, you're gonna have to wait longer.
Exactly, yeah. So I'll reveal kind of the answers of pros and cons, but yeah, that's the main problem. First, you're slow, right? You have to wait to collect like the firing rate, to estimate the firing rate. And if you have large range of values, then the small values will be really seldom spikes. So I have to wait for that one. The high values also have a problem. Can anyone guess which one? So if I have a large range of numbers and I have very high value, what will happen then? Sorry? Everything mixed, yeah. But also for individual neurons, like think that we're building this hardware to be energy efficient, right? And now I represent like the value, and the high value is very high firing rate. And yeah, maybe I didn't mention, but the spikes are expensive, right? When I spike, I send some pulse, I activate this digital communication thing. So spikes are expensive, no spikes is cheap. So no spikes is good, spikes are expensive. So if I use rate coding and I have the number 255 that I need to represent, I have to fire, and I want to be fast, let's say, right? So I make my time step really, really tiny, and then I have to emit a ton of spikes. All these spikes will be communicated to downstream neurons, need to be integrated there, right? And then again, we have high firing rate. So my chip will be like burning. Okay, so test some problems, rate coding. That's why people also look into other encoding, and also in neuroscience. In neuroscience, people see both. So you do see some neurons that really do rate encoding, and I'll maybe come to an example where that happens. But another version would be time to first spike. So you don't wait for second, third, and any other spike to estimate the firing rate of this particular neuron. You just take the time of the first spike, because if the spike is early, it means that its internal variable, this memory potential, was very high, and it just booms and it kind of crossed the threshold very quickly. If its memory potential was low, then it took a long time to accumulate input and then to fire. So here, kind of late spike means small value, early spike means high value. And I can use that, so the advantage will be, I'll maybe reveal the advantages. So the first one is slow, need to average, inefficient, many spikes, and this efficiency resolution trade-off is just not quite optimal, right? So if I have very low resolution, either firing or not, then I can be efficient, but if I have high resolution, then it's not very efficient. This one can also be slow, because I still have to wait, not wait, but wait, like W-A-I-T, wait for a very small value, because the small value will arrive, who knows when. So I can, if I need a very fast reaction, like that frog catching flies, or in a drone that needs to be controlled, then it might still be a bit slow. You can already think of alternative that is not here, actually. The alternative, like, what if I want to be fast? What can I do? Because the time to first spike doesn't help me, doesn't save me. The phase coding is very similar to time to first spike. It's just the definition of kind of this line. Here it's relative to the stimulus, right? So then it's easy. If I have some experiment, stimulus comes, and then I can do this. Like, I present my image, and then I do that. But remember, we were trying to get to autonomous systems, so there's no one who gives me the paste, right? So I sometimes have to decide things myself. And this is where phase coding comes handy, where I assume in my system there's some background oscillation. And for brain, that works nicely. We do have some oscillations in our brain, alpha rhythm, beta rhythm, gamma, delta, all kind of rhythms. And then people do find that they play computational roles. So there are some parts of the brain, for instance, olfactory circuits that indeed seem to have this type of coding. There's some background oscillation, and then you have this temporal coding relative to the peak of this oscillation, right? So, you always have, the pattern is repeating periodically, and then right, the timing of the spikes encodes the value. Okay, so does anyone have any idea? Yeah, first maybe the question, and then the idea, what shall we do if we want to be fast?
Yeah, so no idea yet, but it seems like all of these have like a very strong dependence on time, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm with a static problem like an image, all right, but if I want to have it control like a real time problem, doesn't that mean that like all of these time constants have to fit like the time constants of my real world problem too? Like if I'm in robotics, it's going to be a lot slower than I don't know, like the image recognition thing. Yeah. So if I want to control a robot, it's not going to react in nanoseconds or whatever.
This is a wonderful question on so many levels. So first, yes, timing is important. And this is one thing about neuromorphic computing. So what you will hear in this field is timing is what matters. It's all about timing. It's computing with timing. Like you see all this time is important. And then at some point I will show you this circuit, like one of the neuromorphic circuits, and there will be a little capacitor there. And this capacitor stands for the time constant. And so the first wave of neuromorphic computing, these academics who were developing circuits similar to biology, they made a huge effort to make this capacitor really big, to make the timescales match the biological timescales. Biological timescales are relatively slow compared to our electronic timescales. And that's the Zurich group, right? Or like the Kava-Meads, the original neuromorphics group. And then there's, for instance, a group in Heidelberg in Germany who decided not to do that. They also have this analog VLSI philosophy, but they decided to not slow down their circuits artificially and just let them run as fast as possible. And then their neurons are 10,000 times faster than biological neurons. They say it's a good thing because now we can run simulations, these spiky neural network simulations in our hardware very efficiently and also 10,000 times faster. So we can run learning experiments, or we can be more efficient there. The Zurich people then answer, but look, our neurons are as slow as biological ones, and we know biological ones control behavior of humans. And we want to have robots that are as good, as skillful as humans. So it's good that our timescales match, because now if we also get some circuits inspired from biology, it will all match, and our neurons will be able to control behavior. So that's the story there. And there I come into game, actually. And I think I take your argument that still the timescale of neurons is relatively slow compared to electronics, but it's still pretty fast compared to behavior. Right, so the timescale is usually milliseconds. The time constant is milliseconds. The neuron itself, because it needs to accumulate this, maybe it's 100 milliseconds. But still, if I'm looking for my key, I have to somehow keep the state active for minutes, right? Or even if I move my arm compared to my eye, right, it might take like a second to get to this bong bong, so that's where one of the computing frameworks come into place. So how shall we program, how shall we wire up these neuromorphic circuits? And then some other people ask, so how are biological circuits wired up in biological brains to enable to bridge these timescales? And the answer is attractor dynamics. So the answer is these populations of neurons, they create dynamics that have attractors. And the neurons, they just go into this attractor and stay there forever, potentially, as long as needed. And I wait for you to finish the task. When you finish the task, I have some mechanism to destroy the attractor, and then I go to the next attractor. So there's this field that thinks this attractor dynamics is what helps you to bridge the timescales. Very deep question. Okay, on the other hand, in robotics, so I want to control slow effectors. I would solve it with this kind of attractor dynamics. It's still related to the answer to how to be fast. And also in biological systems, sometimes the biological systems are so fast, like we can be so fast with slow neurons. And the answer to that is, so in rate coding, I just quickly mentioned the rate coding could be defined for a single neuron. And this is what you do when you translate your deep network into a spiking network. You take a single neuron, input neuron, and you encode it with spiking rate. Or you can do it for populations of neurons. And if you do it with populations of neurons, then you can actually be fast. I will show how you can do it explicitly, and there will be a little jump. That's because I've just stolen the slide very quickly today in the morning from another presentation. Okay, so to set the scene, we wanted to control a drone with one of these chips, analog ones, with slow neurons. And we wanted to be fast. We wanted to show with this system we can be as fast as with nothing else. And controlling, it was a 1 degree of freedom drone. It was like 2 propellers here, and it was just rotating like this. Okay, so we have an angle that we measure with IMU. So we have a set point, and then we have an angle. Yeah, we have a set point 25 degrees. We measure the angle of this drone at the moment, and then we have this velocity, right? The values have some range. So the question is, I have my neuromorphic chip. How can I represent these values? And this is an example when I put conventional algorithm. I want to implement a PID controller. How do I put this conventional algorithm on my neuromorphic chip? Step number 1, I have my measured values. I measure angles in degrees. How do I represent these degrees on the chip? So what I can do is to use something, I called it sparse space code. So important is space code or place code. So I say I take a population of neurons and the identity of the neuron encodes the value. So this would be 0 degrees, 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. I have more neurons, I have higher resolution, I have fewer neurons, I have lesser resolution. It doesn't have to be so strict because I can imagine when I measure my angle with this inertia measurement unit, I could project like a little Gaussian kind of smoothing function, right? So that it's not like one-to-one, one measurement, but I have some kind of uncertainty. So let's say I have 100 neurons here, and I would, the input kind of mapping is little Gaussians with little blur. What it helps me, so in principle, I could only have 2 neurons here, and I could already represent any value, right? If there's a Gaussian coming from my measurement to these 2 neurons. So I can have like a super resolution, but still, it's true that the more neurons I have, the better my resolution is. So here I had like 64 neurons for, like 80 degrees or something. But still, so I can just kind of spread my values in this population of neurons. So now, in order to represent the value, a single spike is enough. So and it will come as fast as possible for this neuron, right? So with this millisecond time resolution. Because now I don't measure this time, I actually don't care. Just the fact that the spike came from neuron number 3 votes for the current measurement being 3. So these are just like votes over time. So with this system, we could be very fast. And I'll show this example in more detail like later when I talk about the algorithms. But yeah, identity of an active neuron represents the value. Each spike carries the value. And then population code can account for uncertainty. So if I have many neurons in this population, then neuron number 4 might fire as well, neuron number 2 might fire as well. So I can have some measure of uncertainty. Yep, there's a microphone, I think, somewhere already closed. There's a colleague over there.
Yes. Just something I didn't understand about the past slide about the phase coding. So apparently it was the best solution, right, for what you wrote on the slide. But do I get it that this is basically a clock signal, the background oscillation? Like, is that value of the oscillation like something that is multiplied to the value of the actual spike? So when the oscillation is low, the spike is very low in voltage or whatever, so the analog values, like, is it a kind of a clock, or how does it work?
Yeah, so on the one hand side, neuromorphic people like very much that their hardware doesn't have clocks. So most of them don't have clocks, and they're very proud of that because there are no clocks in the brain. Now there's a little kind of caveat because there are these oscillations in the brain, and people say they're a little bit like clocks. So de facto, yes, this is like some periodic signal that for some reason is out there in the system. In the brain, like, complex system thingy, it could be that this clock is just emerging, like, because, it just happens, your activity, like, just starts, and there's more activity at some point that creates this oscillation going up. So it kind of naturally emerges some periodicity. As in other, systems, biological systems, you have this natural periodicity. In your artificial system, you could indeed kind of artificially create some periodical boost to all the neurons, and then they all can fire, and if someone had higher action potential, will fire first, someone had lower, will fire a bit later, but everyone will fire within some fixed period. So you know when to expect your answers, you know how long you have to wait, so it's kind of a good thing. So yeah, definitely has some relation to the clock. However, Here, like I personally like this type of coding most because it gives you some power. Because now, like here, for instance, if I have any of like these also like nice representation, how do I represent uncertainty? Is there like any means for me to represent uncertainty that this value is like plus minus 5 and this value is plus minus 0.5? Like no space for that anymore. Here, I have kind of, because in this population, I can be very fast and just react to the first spike, or I could wait for more spikes. I could look at other neurons, because I know that there's a notion of similarity, like implicitly in this area. I have ordered them. I told you this is the 0 degree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the brain, they don't have to be ordered, but because of their connectivity between them, they are kind of ordered, and there's kind of a metric space defined. So in this kind of theory, one of the frameworks that I will represent is attractor dynamics. So these attractors, they are defined in metrical spaces. And our brains, one could argue, evolved to move around in metrical spaces. First, just in space. So there's a very strong argument that brains evolved to move in space. Full stop. And an example for that is a little mollusk that is out there, which has a brain, swims in the sea with a brain, and then in some stage in its life, it attaches itself to a stone. And people also see it as a metaphor for tenure in your academic career. But at that point, it starts eating its brain because it doesn't need it anymore. Yeah, don't tell it to other fellow academics if they don't know the joke yet. Yeah, but that's the true biological fact, right? So you don't need the brain if you don't move. And indeed, moving around is a dangerous thing. So you need to think ahead, you need to plan. To plan, you need to be able to do these reference frame transformations. What will happen, how the world will look like when I do one step. It's complex stuff that needs to happen. Yeah, so if brain evolved to move around, it has all this machinery, remember that hippocampal circuit that was about moving in space, moving in time, episodic memory. So it seems that fundamentally the brain is about moving in some spaces where there's a notion of something being close to each other or being further away from each other. People call it metrics, right? The distances matter. And the distances can be in space, can be in velocity space. Someone is fast, someone is equally fast, or very, very, very much faster or slower. It can be in feature space, like the color space. Some things are similar or dissimilar. So this notion of similarity is kind of implicit here. So I have neighboring neurons that encode for similar things. And I can there's a very rich representational substrate there. What is the downside of this? There's no free lunch theorem, right? And then again, I'll come back to this attractor frameworks at some point, because in this attractor framework that I will talk about, you make a decision between them. Yeah, because that's a good question. Like, what do I do? I have some multimodal distribution. So if I define some connectivity in this population that creates this certain type of attractors, then the two things will compete. One of them will win. I'll make a decision, act on it. Maybe I will decide it was a wrong decision. For next time, I'll weigh them differently. Yeah, so quite a powerful mechanism.
So in this encoding approach, the resolution of the wrong signal will be dependent on the number of the neurons, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a trade-off. It's costly. I need more neurons, right? To represent a single measurement of my angle, I need at least 10 neurons, maybe 100 if I have a high resolution. And neurons are of course costly, right? In hardware, also in biological hardware. So yeah, there's a trade-off. Absolutely no free lunch anywhere. Always a trade-off. Here the trade-off neurons, and it's questionable, right, whether you want to have more neurons. It brings you wonderful properties. Really would be nice to have neurons cheaper in your hardware, if you ever develop hardware. Okay, guys, I have to accelerate. Time flies with you. Okay, so I just wanted to show you this to introduce some circuit diagrams. So how do you come from all these almost empirical models, how to model the section potentials that people observed in biology? What does it have to do with hardware? So what people whom I will show in a couple slides noticed 30 or 40 years ago, that these dynamics that we have observed, these exponentials, we know circuits that do that. You can have a simple RC circuit, right, and you write down equation for that, this Kirchhoff law, right? The current that goes here splits, go left and right? So this one is, your potential divided by resistance, and this one is your capacitance and then the unity. So I can extract the du, kind of u dot, right? How my action potential changes over time. And the equation that I got is very similar to the equation of that neuron that I have written down, and it's actually an attractor equation, if you notice, because the solution to this equation, right, u dot minus u plus something plus input, the solution is exponential, right? Kind of a decaying exponential minus something divided by t, by some time constant. You can do the math yourself at home. Differential equation, right? A very, very simple one. So if you try to solve it, right? So you see the derivative of a function is the function itself with a minus in front of it. Exponential, right, has this property. Exponential minus x has this property. And then you get these exponentials in this very simple circuit. So people have seen, we can easily build these neurons, right? Just with a couple things, maybe a couple more. I'll show you a couple more that I needed. And then we need to do this magic with the threshold and spiking. But threshold, we just need some comparator, right? You hardware guys know it better than me how to build a comparator. And then, so if threshold is reached, we'll do some magic. We'll probably, maybe discharge this capacitor that have accumulated all that potential, and we'll start the whole story again. So people were playing with this kind of thoughts, and in the end, they did design the circuit that you could produce, and that will reproduce many of the behaviors of biological neurons. And I'll show you in a second. So when designing this beauty, this is analog kind of electronics with the transistors in subthreshold regime. So the transistors are not used as 0 and 1 generators. They are used with their kind of exponential functions as well. The goal here was to mimic these dynamics of biological neurons, how they integrate incoming spikes, how they leak. And then they were trying to model some receptors. So there's some NMDA receptors. So one type of input has particular properties. They try to mimic it. There's a leakage that is controlled with different parameters like tau of leakage and threshold, some other tau. So a ton of parameters that are all related to this biological model. A little bit more detailed than the one I have shown you previously. But now you can go to this beautiful paper from Giacomo Indivieri. It's written in 2015. The work is more like from the 90s and maybe early 2000s. But this is when they have produced the chip. I would claim this is the first chip that actually worked. So I worked with it. I made controlled robots with a chip based on this circuit. And now I'll try to show you. Maybe next time, tomorrow, I'll show you a couple circuits from there. All right. So what you get is dynamics like this. So this is now the activity of one of the neurons. This is the membrane potential, the voltage, this membrane potential, and different examples of dynamics that you can get. So here you have spike frequency adaptation. And this is something biological neurons do. If you have the same constant stimulus, in the beginning the neuron is super excited, but then it gets bored. So its firing rate gets down. You can kind of shift with some parameter the time of the spike, like how much it integrates, the integration constant. You can get behavior like this. This is a bursting neuron. So you get it to some kind of threshold, then it starts firing like very, very, very frequently. So you can get the whole zoo of behaviors that people also observe in biological neurons. So now we can start a nice discussion, right, to develop this circuit to mimic biology. The philosophy there, I'll come to that in the historical outlook in the last couple minutes. But you don't ask the question why. Like, why is it good to have adaptation? Is it good to have adaptation? We know there are neurons that do that, but maybe those are useless neurons. Like, maybe they're not used for any useful computation. So there's a lot of work, I think. So of course, it's good to discover and to see what can we implement in hardware. But in parallel, I maybe wish there would be more work being done. So what of this is useful? What of this is computationally relevant? And then how far you go there in this usefulness? And I think it's there we can start talking about the science, politics, and kind of dividing lines between academic fields. Because in the end, what brains are doing, right, they're producing behavior, moving in the world. So I think it's important to bridge the gap from looking at these potentials of individual neurons to me moving somewhere. Right, what happens in between? How do I need to wire up neurons that do this to actually produce movement? If we know that, then we'll start building neuromorphic chips like that are useful. Okay, I'll just flash quickly another important just postulate number 2. So the first postulate were neurons. And this is a postulate because one can also say dogma, that neurons are what does computation in the brain. And this dogma is a little bit questionable in the modern neuroscience. First, there are a couple other cell types in the brain that are not neurons, and people say they might also be important for computation. They're called like astrocytes or glia cells. They're all over the place. They don't spike, so you cannot see what they're doing. And it's, you know this joke, right? Looking for the key where the lamp is. That's what we're doing. We can measure what neurons are doing, what these other cells are doing. We cannot measure, so we just assume they don't do anything useful, but who knows? And then there are all kinds of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin. They just wash our brain in some global signals that definitely play a very important role in behavior, but they're also not part of neural dogma. But this neural dogma is that neurons are all we need. One could put a question mark there, but today, we assume neurons are at least a large part of what we need. The second thing are the synapses. So in neurobiology and in neuromorphic computing, we don't talk about weights between neurons, we talk about synapses. And a synapse is a complex beast. Synapse is actually these parts. So this is one of the axons, let's say, of the neuron, remember that output channel? And this is the dendrite of another neuron, the input channel. And between them, there's a little gap. Cleft, synaptic cleft. And in this gap, magic happens, because in this gap, the two guys communicate with each other. And there's a pretty complex biochemical process. So there are these vesicles that bring some ions, and at some point they're released, and then there's current flowing. So this is how this communication between neurons happens. And for it to happen, you need this huge bump, this huge hammer thingy of a spike to come here. Little fluctuations of electrical activity, you don't care. If spike comes, the channels open and boom, the other neuron, hey guys, something happened here. Right, so that's why spikes are how neurons communicate with each other through the synaptic cleft. So you can model the synapses, right? Usually in the models that are then used for neuromorphic hardware, the synapses have indeed weight, how strong they are. In biology, this is reflected with the size of the button. So this is called button, and it can be small or it can be big. If it's big, there are more places where ions can be released, so the signal transmission will be stronger. The spike comes, and then it's multiplied with a larger weight. So there's a concept of a weight. So weight, and these synapses also have delay. Because when the signal comes here, the signal is just this binary kind of spike. The synapse can delay it. So it can be transmitted immediately in 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds, 5 milliseconds. So the biological neurons and the neurons in neuromorphic hardware have the notion of delay, and it, of course, also, again, opens up another computational dimension. Now here, plasticity is the learning. That's the rule according to which the synapse can grow or become smaller. So it can become stronger or smaller. And all synapses do that. They become stronger or smaller. They all do that based on activity of the neuron before and after. The neuron before is called presynaptic neuron, before this gap, and this one is called postsynaptic neuron. And but people got super excited when they discovered that the neurons do causality. And how do they do causality? So what they did, they would make this neuron spike, and make this neuron spike, and then see what happens with the connection between them. And they have discovered if these spikes are ordered so that the presynaptic spike comes first, and then the postsynaptic spike comes shortly after. So this J is the pre, and the I is the post, right? So if there's a causality, so the pre is first and the post is second, if the causality is right, the synapse gets stronger. And if the causality is wrong, the synapse gets weaker. So they've discovered that these synapses, they can discover causality, and they can learn. Anyone sees any problem with that? Let me know. And so people were making plots like this, where here you have this difference in timing between these two spikes, pre and post. So the negative means that first pre, then post, and here first post, then pre. And the dots show whether the change of the synapse is positive or negative, so whether it's growing or whether it's going down. And so for pre then post, it was growing, right? And the closer they are to each other, the stronger the growth. And if post and pre, then it was going down. It was depressing. It was becoming weaker. So a lot of excitement, and then at some point, like people discovered synapses that do the opposite thing. They discover anti-causality, and synapses that just don't care about the order of spikes. They do care about their proximity, but not the order. So there seems to be the whole zoo of synaptic plasticity rules. But what is common in all these synapses is that they all change, they all learn all the time. So there's no like training and then it's all frozen. They can change more or less. So there are some synapses that are fairly stable, but you can make them unstable. And their change depends on activity of the pre and postsynaptic neuron. And like neurophysiologically, it only makes sense that they depend on activity of these two neurons and nothing else, not the other neurons. So if you want to do some kind of batch normalization, or if you want to see what was the delta error of delta another weight, this guy cannot know that. So it doesn't see the other synapse. They're just very far away, like biochemically. So that sets some constraints on learning, and that's my kind of last slide for today. Synaptic plasticity and learning. So if our learning mechanism is some kind of gradient descent and backpropagation, then my synapses need to know how the other synapses are changing, depending on some error which is very far away. And biological neurons just cannot know that. Like no way they cannot know that. So the question is, how do we learn? We do learn stuff, right? All kind of stuff. We learn facts, we learn like maps and objects, we learn skills, we learn like motor skills, and it's all like with this type of learning. There are some details. So for instance, in some synapses, you will only have learning if there's some third factor present, like dopamine. So if you're happy, then you learn. In some other neurons, if you're unhappy, then you learn. I think there are more the ones that learn when you are happy. So I think that this question, a lot of neuromorphic computing people ask themselves, how can we make the system learn? But what people have done is that they, just in case, have implemented these plasticity rules in hardware. So in this analog hardware, VLSI hardware, there's a circuit that implements the plastic synapse. So it has this differential pair integrator that compares, in the end, it's not exactly the timing of spikes, it's a proxy for a timing of spikes. So what is done there, when the presynaptic neuron fires, it triggers processing that looks at the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron. And if this membrane potential is high, then this neuron is about to fire. So the causality will be the right one. And if it's low, it is just fired. So then you don't learn. And then in some range, you just don't care. So you either learn positively, learn negatively, or you don't care. And then you have like a bunch of circuits that do comparison with different thresholds. Like, for this membrane potential on the output neuron. Is it below some threshold? Is it above some threshold? Is it in the middle? Again, this paper, you can study all the magic behind these circuits. Okay, I will finish here for today. I'm 5 minutes over the time. Sorry for that.